think we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Chris. I'm one of the organizers for this evening. And I guess first off, I want to start out just by saying kind of how this all came together. So after a lot of news came out in Pennsylvania, me and some friends were kind of trying to figure out how to think about this, how to process and work through it. So I decided to host a group at my house just to have like an informal evening discussion, just to kind of go over what are some thoughts. And I learned a lot. There was a pretty diverse group in terms of background. We had someone who worked in the Department of Corrections. We had a mental health therapist. I'm an attorney. We also had a seminarian. And that was a really productive conversation, and I felt that I learned a lot that I wish I would have known beforehand. And after that conversation, Tucker, who will be up in just a few minutes, decided that we thought it would be helpful to have this conversation at a larger level, invite more people in. So we kind of started organizing this, and we had a second discussion at my house where we talked about the John Jay report, which I'll go over tonight. And during that conversation, someone had mentioned how we really should host like a prayer or a service of some sort, because that's really important as Catholics. So then we had the prayer vigil it was about a week ago. And then this has just kind of come together. And we wanted people to come together and talk about this. And as I've been processing this and thinking about how to respond, I've kind of thought about 4 components in responding to crisis. So one being prayer, education, dialogue, and then action. And it's kind of a cyclical process where you kind of go to action and back to prayer. And it should be really an integrated thing. And so the prayer visual was obviously prayer. And then tonight we're going to kind of focus on some of the education and dialogue components, and with an eye towards action. So I'm going to go over a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. This is roughly the overview. So some of it's going to be presentations. We're going to go over kind of the crisis. I'll very briefly talk about the abuse crisis in the U.S. Tucker is going to talk about the Archdiocese and some of the history here. I'll discuss the McCarrick scandal. I'll also go over the John Jay report, and then also one way to kind of frame how we think about these issues. After that, we're going to open up to kind of table discussions. And I'd like for everyone to kind of keep in mind a few things about table, or about this room. Is there are people here who've had very personal experiences with this issue. People come from very different backgrounds. There are people here that would identify as liberal. There are people here who would identify as conservative. Most likely there are people in this room who hold views that you would probably find really offensive, and probably me as well. So one thing that I keep coming back to is that with this crisis, this is kind of everyone's issue. This is something that we all kind of own because we're all Catholic, no matter where we come from or what our perspectives are. And I would like this to be an opportunity for all of us to just kind of I think about sit in the living room together. Somehow we need to find a way to sit down. And so I'd kind of like to invite everyone to kind of resist the impulse, which I have quite often, to debate or correct one another. If someone says something to you that's really troubling or offensive, feel free to ask questions and try to understand their perspective, and just try to understand where they're coming from. Also, there are water fountains in the back. If you at any time need to just take a step away, I think there are bathrooms over there. Feel free to excuse yourself if you need, for whatever reason, take a little break. So the discussion portion is going to be in 2 parts. There's going to be one where it's perspectives, where you just kind of go around and share some of what your thoughts are on these issues. There is, at each table, someone who's been assigned to kind of take notes and help kind of moderate a little bit. They're not going to write down your names or personal information, But we want to kind of get to a collection or a pulse of where the young adult community is at with all of the kind of like diverse viewpoints. And we may do some write-ups after this on kind of like what the young adult community in the Twin Cities like thinks and how we approach these issues. And then we'll move into kind of the second part, which is action items, and we'll be interested in kind of your ideas and brainstorming on what are some things that you would like to see the Archdiocese do to create light, promote healing, and build trust. I'm looking for kind of like very concrete, specific actionable items, and we'll write those down as well and kind of compile a list, possibly with the idea of drafting a letter from the young adult community to the Archdiocese. And then after that, we'll have a little bit of like large group time where people can share kind of like things that like they learned or found interesting or that they kind of thought about in a new way. And then after that, we'll close with some things, one of them being prevention strategies for abuse that come out of the John Jay report. Wes will come up and talk about kind of like what we can do as young adults to kind of like continue to like take ownership as this is our church, and to take responsibility for it. And then we'll kind of go over what's next for all of this. And after that, if you want to continue the conversation, I'll say it's at the end, but we'll probably go to Bulldog. So you're all welcome to go there as well. So I think I will start off with just briefly kind of the clerical abuse in the U.S. with size. So between 1950 and 2002, when the Boston Globe broke their reporting on Boston, there were 4,392 American priests accused of abuse of minors. That represents roughly 4% of priests, and there are allegations by 10,667 individuals. After that time, there were more than a dozen bankruptcies. I believe there were 13. This archdiocese was number 12. And reports of abuse have spiked around the time of major scandals. So 1985, after the case of Father Galf opened up, and then in 2002, when the Boston Globe broke their reporting. And Tucker's handing around kind of this PowerPoint if anyone wants to look at it at any time. I'm going to pass it over to him.
Good evening. I was charged with the responsibility of telling you about a little bit of our history in this archdiocese when it comes to the abuse of children and minors and vulnerable adults, which is not comfortable. I was raised here. I'm a member of the Basilica, and I'm also a Catholic school teacher, and so these things are hard to talk about, but I think acknowledging our failures helps us build toward a better future. And this kind of hit close to home for me as I was kind of when I was in college when a lot of these reports were coming out. My childhood pastor was on the list that came out in 2014, and then I found out that the predecessor before him and then the predecessor before him. So it kind of felt like I'd been shamed a little bit. But first we're going to talk about Archbishop Flynn, Harry Flynn. He was appointed the Archbishop of St. Paul, Minneapolis in 1995 after serving the Diocese of Lafayette, Louisiana, and he served Minnesota until 2008. And when Archbishop Flynn was in Lafayette, he was made aware of many situations of abuse. No police reports were ever filed in Lafayette, and that was kind of one of the first high-profile cases of abuse by a cleric to a minor. And it was during that time in Louisiana that he gained this reputation as a healer bishop, as a bishop who understood the cleric abuse crisis very well. And shortly after Flynn became the Archbishop of St. Paul in Minneapolis, the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled that the state's statute of limitations had been interpreted too broadly to allow nearly anyone to sue for past sexual abuse. So it ruled that any lawsuits for past abuse must be filed by the victim before they turned 24. And so that halted a number of cases that would have come before the Archdiocese during his episcopate. And then on the national level, Flynn led the 2002 Atlanta Charter Initiative draft due to his extensive work in the protection of minors, or so we thought, in the Diocese of Lafayette. And the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis was at that time considered, by the local press at least, a trailblazer in handling these abuse cases. So Flynn was the obvious choice. And the Atlanta Charter is kind of jargon for the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People that was adopted by the USCCB in 2002, and there have been several drafts since then. And among the many triumphs of the Charter, there were actually no penalties for bishops who did not act in accord with the Charter, which we found out with McCarrick. And after that experience in Atlanta, he came back to Minneapolis, where there were still 11 priests in active ministry who had been credibly accused of abuse. And it was after that time that a lot of priests took medical retirement, but some still remained in ministry. In 2005, a monitoring program for abusive priests was initiated that was successful to some extent, and it put a priest in charge of going to observe different priests who had been credibly accused of abuse. And it wasn't until 2006 that a priest had been removed from ministry despite the no tolerance language in the charter that said any priest who had been credibly accused ever would be removed from ministry. And it wasn't until 2006 that actually happened here. And then we move on to Archbishop Nienstedt, who was appointed after Flynn announced his retirement. And Archbishop Nienstedt was appointed by Pope Benedict in 2008 to succeed Harry Flynn. And upon entering the chancery, he kind of cleaned house and appointed a bunch of new leadership. Most notably, in terms of the history, Father Kevin McDonough, who was the Vicar General for both Archbishops Roach, Flynn's predecessor, and Archbishop Flynn. He was replaced by Father Peter Laird. Dr. Jennifer Hasselberger, a very successful canon lawyer, was appointed chancellor under Nienstedt, and she was kind of in charge of preparing priest files when they came up for considerations for new appointments, and she discovered a lot of cases of abuse that had been kind of put literally in the basement. And then during one time, especially when it came to the reassignment of a priest named Father Curtis Waymeyer, he had propositioned sex to several strangers, including at parks and bookstores, and then entered therapy for sexually addicted priests. And upon his return to St. Paul, Archbishop Nienstedt appointed him to Blessed Sacrament in St. Paul with no warning of his past to the parishioners who were there. And it was there that he went on to abuse 2 children, the sons of a parish employee. And this led to the resignation of Jennifer Hasselberger because she consistently warned people above her of his status as a potential abuser. And she became kind of the main whistleblower for the Archdiocese, and that's why we know a lot of what we know now. 2 weeks later, the Minnesota State Senate opened a 3-year window for reporting sexual assault called the Child Victims Act, and this is pretty significant. And this is what resulted in dozens of cases against the Archdiocese for clerical sexual abuse, including the Doe 1 case, which was a lawsuit against the Winona and St. Paul Diocese for negligence and creating a public nuisance, which ultimately resulted in a settlement. And per that settlement, the Archdiocese published a list of 33 of St. Paul and Minneapolis priests and 13 priests from the Diocese of Winona who had been credibly accused of abuse. A third of them had been dead at the time, but there were still quite a few who were not. In addition to the Doe 1 case and the investigation into Curtis Waymeyer, the Archbishop himself authorized an investigation into allegations of sexual impropriety that were brought against him, including affairs with seminarians and other priests. And we actually don't know what happened there because the investigation was closed and the results have not been made public. And Archbishop Nienstedt, full disclosure, maintains his innocence. And because of the high volume of cases against the Archdiocese, that led the corporation to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in January 2015, which is designed so that the corporation can eventually be lifted into financial viability after settling with its creditors, namely the 400 victims and their families. And then criminal charges were filed against the Archdiocese for the Curtis Waymeyer case, and that prompted the resignation of Archbishop Nienstedt an auxiliary bishop, Lee Pichet, and the appointment of who we have now, Bernard Hebda. And until last week, John Neinstead was associated with the Napa Institute in California, and he's since been relieved of those duties, and that kind of covers what happened under Neinstead. Now we move to Archbishop Hebda, and he was installed as the Archbishop on May 13th, 2016 at the Cathedral after a brief period as Apostolic Administrator. It was the very day that Neinstead resigned that Hebda was appointed Apostolic Administrator. He was still fulfilling obligations as the coadjutor, Archbishop of Newark, New Jersey, and everyone assumed that he was going to return to that job, but luckily for us, he has stayed right here. So he has degrees in politics, law, and theology from Harvard and Columbia and the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and so he was kind of well suited for this job, walking into a bankruptcy and the many legal trials that our diocese faced. But what's most relevant to the conversation today is the most recent settlement of the Chapter 11 bankruptcy that I was just talking about. The settlement was reached at the beginning of the summer, and it's important to remember that the mediation for the settlement began right away after the bankruptcy was filed, and it was hailed by prosecutors and state officials alike, and it set aside $156 million for survivors of clerical abuse to be distributed in undetermined amounts by an independent trustee. So that's all to say that there were a number of changes that happened, and in 2014, the Office of Ministerial Standards and Safe Environment published its new protocol for the protection of minors and vulnerable adults following the settlement of the Doe 1 case. And that's what led to the publishing of that initial list of priests who had been credibly accused. And there's also a number of other protocol that have now been put in place where Attorney John Choi from Ramsey County has called this a new movement of moving forward. And yeah, we are in a much better spot now than we were before.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the Cardinal McCarrick scandal. This came out quite recently. So Cardinal McCarrick was a very prominent American cardinal, mostly on the East Coast. He was incredibly influential. He worked on the Dallas Charter. And on June 20th of this year, he was removed from ministry and resigned on July 27th. After it finally came to the public that for decades he had been engaging in sexual harassment and exploitation of seminarians and younger priests, it turned out that this was a somewhat open secret. Many people knew this. He would invite seminarians. He had a type, and he would have them to his home. They often kind of knew what was going to happen to them. In between 2005 and 2007, two dioceses, Newark and Metuchen, paid settlements in McCarrick abuse cases, which indicated that bishops and other church officials had known about this pattern. And in 2016, Richard Sipe, who is an ex-priest and a psychologist and an expert in clerical abuse, he sent a letter to the Bishop of San Diego. Warning letters were also sent to Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI about McCarrick's abuse, and yet he still remained in doing a lot of active work. And then just a couple of days ago, Archbishop Vigano, former papal nuncio to the U.S., made accusations that Pope Francis was aware of this abuse as well. And out of this, there have been a number of allegations about formators in seminaries across the United States who have sexually harassed seminarians, and networks of priests who had abused priests under them and seminarians under their care. So this is kind of the third and kind of newest scandal that's arisen. So now I'm going to kind of switch from that over to the John Jay report. So in June 2002, after the Boston crisis, the bishops put out the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People. And as part of that, the USCCB established two bodies. One of them was the Office of Child and Youth Protection, which was within the USCCB, and then the other was a National Review Board, which was run by a group of prominent lay Catholics. And these two organizations were charged with investigating abuse cases and also providing recommendations to the bishops. And as part of their work, these two organizations commissioned a study. They wanted to understand the nature and scope of clerical abuse in the United States, and eventually researchers from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice decided to independently take on this study, which they published first in 2004, which is called, it's the Nature and Scope Study. It studied what happened. And then in 2011, they published a follow-up study, which is the Causes and Context Study, and it studied the causes of clerical abuse of minors from a psychological, sociological, and organizational perspective. To date, it's still the largest and most extensive study on these questions. It had a 97% participation of dioceses across the United States. One of the things that they found is that actually clerical abuse of minors follows kind of a curve. So if you look there, you'll see that it rises from the 50s steadily through the 70s, and then right around 1985, there began a sharp decline, which kind of capped out and has been about steady through 2002. And the researchers think that this is probably a roughly accurate representation of what abuse has been like. So they define the clerical abuse scandal of one of minors as a historical phenomenon, and certainly it continues and still needs continued addressing. But they believe that it follows kind of roughly that curve, where the majority of the cases were between kind of the late 50s and 1985. And of course, it takes many years typically before they report, so we should take that into account as we look at this. But this is how the researchers kind of determined the incidents laid out. A few kind of facts in the study. So they determined that about 4% of priests were abusers of minors. About half of those abusers had a single victim. And 3.5% of the abusers were responsible for about a quarter of the victims. So you had a large number of priests abusing, but a small number did a significant amount of the abuse. Something else that was interesting was that priests ordained in the 1970s had been in ministry for an average of 4 years before their first incident of abuse. Those ordained in the 60s, it was about 7 years before their first incident, and before the 1960s, it was about 16 and a half years. So it wasn't like they were instantly abusers right after their ordination. It typically was several years before they had even their first incident. The John Jay report also kind of explores the causes of abuse, and it looks to kind of some of the common things that people point to. One of the things that they looked at was pedophilia and ephebophilia, and they found that actually of the abusers, only 2% could be classified as what we understand as pedophiles, 10.8% classified as ephebophiles, and the majority were generalists, meaning that they didn't specialize in any single type of victim. There's been a follow-up study by Karen Terry, who is from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, who also found that in circumstances where priests had more access to girls, they tended to abuse both boys and girls, and when they had more access to boys and less access to girls, they tended to abuse boys more frequently. They also looked at the question of sexual orientation and identity. They found, so they relied on other researchers for the statistic that there was an increase in homosexual men in the late 70s and 80s in U.S. seminaries. They found that, assuming there was such an increase, it actually correlated with a decrease in abuse incidents. So again, if we kind of go back to that curve, we can see that's on the downslide. So they also looked at sexual identity, kind of broadly, and priests generally, not just abusers, they determined that about 3/4 had a clear sense of sexual identity before they entered seminary, and about a quarter of those identified as homosexual or bisexual. About 63% of the accused priests had a clear articulation of their sexual identity, whereas those who were not accused had 83%. So you were less likely to be an abuser if you had a clear sense of your sexual identity, whatever that identity is. Another interesting statistic is that confusion about sexual identity was especially prominent before the 1970s, which again, if you look at the curve, that would kind of show the peak, because there would be a lot of younger priests at that time. So confusion about sexual identity led to a higher likelihood that the priest was an abuser. Also less relevant to the abuse of minors, but certainly relevant as we discussed the McCarrick situation. Priests who had engaged in pre-seminary same-sex sexual behavior were not significantly more likely to have any type of after-seminary sexual behavior than any other priests. However, those who had engaged in sexual behavior while in seminary were more likely to have post-seminary sexual behavior, but it was more likely with adults than with minors. They also looked at the question of the celibacy requirement, because that's something that comes up quite frequently, and they found that there's no correlation between that requirement and incidence of abuse. So in general, they found that the priest-abuser population, like the broader abuser population, is actually a heterogeneous group, meaning that it's not really possible to identify them beforehand by any single characteristic or experience. But even if you can't identify the abusers beforehand, the researchers determined that it is possible to reduce the opportunities for abuse. And I'll talk a little bit about that. One thing that they drew on was kind of this common model for the preconditions of abuse. It's called Finkelhor's 4 factors. And he determines that, this is a very helpful framework for thinking about preventing abuse. For abuse to happen, you need, number 1, the abuser to have a motivation to abuse. Number 2, the abuser needs to overcome their internal inhibitions to abuse. 3, they need to overcome external factors. And 4, they need to overcome the child's resistance. And the way that this often works is that the motivation to abuse is often kind of emotional congruence with the minor and and a lack of healthy, intimate relationships with adults. So that they won't have kind of appropriate adult relationships, and they'll go to minors to have a relationship, and then that will eventually develop into abuse. Overcoming the internal inhibitions to abuse. So most people obviously know that abuse of minors is wrong, but abusers tended to create excuses and justifications, and so that they could kind of allow themselves to engage in that abuse. These are also known as techniques of neutralization. 3, the overcoming of external factors. So these are kind of the physical context for abuse. They need a place for it to happen. They need everything to kind of be right for the actual physical act to occur. And then 4 is they need to overcome the child's resistance through grooming techniques. The study discusses the gifts that the abusers would give to children. Sometimes it would be money, sometimes it would be positions in the parish as altar servers or certain positions of authority. Sometimes they would give them pornography, alcohol, drugs. And all of this is to kind of create trust, build secrets between the abuser and the child, so that they can eventually have that sort of relationship and the child's less likely to tell others about it. So, after all of that, I'm going to kind of propose one way to think about what's going on in the Catholic Church with this crisis. I'm going to propose that it's not really one crisis, but it's 3 both distinct but also interrelated crises. The first one is the clerical abuse of minors. Second is the McCarrick scandal, which stands broadly for sexual exploitation and harassment of younger priests and seminarians by senior clergy. And then the third is the cover-up, so hiding all of this. And I'd like to propose that actually responding to these crises, these each will need their own response. Resolving one will not necessarily resolve the other 2. So, at this point, I know this was a lot of information for everyone, so we're just going to kind of take a break for just a few minutes. Feel free to get up, get water, go to the bathroom. Feel free to write down thoughts, reactions, anything that you want to talk about in the discussion portion, and again, anything that you would like to give to the table leaders later on as we kind of do our write-ups and kind of determine where everyone's at. there's like much more to be said, obviously, and certainly like continue this afterwards. One thing that I will say is that like this is a very large issue. None of us hold all the pieces to the solution, and so we all need one another. I think we're all just kind of doing the best with what we've got, and so we need to be able to kind of like work together, to call one another out when we need it, so we're going to kind of switch gears again. I promise not a lot longer. So one of the things that I kind of wanted to draw your attention to is, again, the John Jay report. So at the end of the report, it has recommendations for prevention strategies, and I just wanted to go over a few of those. So one is the education piece. So human formation in seminary. So that's kind of essential. It's been developing, but it still needs further development. Another one is continuing education for priests. Not a lot of dioceses have this ongoing, and so they really emphasize how like once a priest gets out there, you still need to continue to educate them. It also used situational prevention models, which is really big in criminology, to mitigate risks of abuse. So one is increase the effort involved in abuse by making it more difficult to commit the abuse. Usually this is done by education, especially education of the laity, of potential victims, and then also education of priests. Teach them what's appropriate and what's not. One is increase the risk of abuse by recommends a zero tolerance policy and periodic evaluations of priests. Reduce rewards of abuse by providing alternate outlets for close bonds with others. Again, it mentioned how for those who might be inclined to abuse, they're at especially high risk in times of stress, isolation, and reduce provocations for abuse. So reduce the factors that may lead to that, also stress, loneliness, isolation. And then also remove the excuses. So teach priests about what appropriate behaviors are. Be very specific. Some priests who had abused said that it wasn't really that bad because it wasn't sex. So we need to continue to educate on what's appropriate and what's not. And then the final thing that it focused on was on oversight and accountability, which it said is extremely essential. You need buy-in and routinization. The study said that it can take a decade for a lot of these changes to become routine and to really be effective. So you need it to be constantly going. There needs to be more transparency in reporting and dealing with abuse, and then increased accountability of mechanisms. So that's just kind of recommendations. So now I'm going to turn it over to Wes. And there are many things that we can do from the top, and he's going to talk just a little bit about what we can do from the bottom.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. Any of you guys who know me, you know that this is a topic that I'd love to harp on, so I'll try to still be brief. I think first and foremost, I want to say that it's kind of fitting that we come together and have this discussion today on the feast day of St. Augustine. If we think about our doctor of the church, our doctor of grace, you read anything about his life, and it was not at all like this whole, entirely holy, clean-cut path, and not for a minute to say that he lived a life of abuse or impropriety or anything, but what he did through writing his confessions, through everything that he preached, is he put his life in full display of the public. The good, the bad, the proper, the improper. And yes, it caused scandal. It caused scandal among the faithful, among the people who weren't Catholic. But scandal is not, I wrote it down because I knew I was going to mess it up. Scandal is not avoiding the avoiding scandal is to avoid the appearance of something improper or evil. It is not providing evil a place of refuge. So if we as the church are trying to cover up these things that are in themselves evil, that's not avoiding scandal. That's providing a place for corruption and evil to take root. So the best thing that we can do now, just like Augustine did with his own life, is to put everything that's true on full display and trusting in God to take the rest. You guys can all look through this, but some of the things I do want to touch about that aren't on there is a lot of times we can feel powerless, kind of as the laity in the church, like what can we do? Like the bishops and everything are organized in a way that we don't have any say into what goes on. I know our canon lawyer here will actually probably appreciate this, but the Code of Canon Law, sections 208 through 223, actually lists out the rights and obligations of the laity. So this is the church law that actually lists out the powers and the abilities that the laity has to work within the church, the rights that we all have to demand and to hold our bishops and our leaders accountable to certain things. So yeah, that's just a quick aside. I think the first and foremost thing that we need to do in this situation, though, is to pray. A lot of times it can seem very frivolous, and I know one of our group leaders here actually got asked by a news reporter, like, what's the point of praying? It won't change anything. I think a lot of times we trivialize prayer because it's not something tangible. Prayer is the first and foremost thing that we should be doing, and it's our greatest source of agency in these situations. I think, honestly, as lay people, we can all take Virtus training. Your parishes will pay for it. It's completely free, and it's like a morning to do something that will actually allow you to notice abuse, to call out abuse, and to provide more of a culture in the parishes where we can handle and deal with these things as they occur. Educate and challenge yourself. A lot of times we as Catholics get into this place of, we know a lot, we know like Thomas Aquinas' arguments, we've read the confessions, you get comfortable and you get apathetic. Part of what moves us to be active players in the church and in this is to educate and challenge yourself. Never become complacent with where you're at. Or, is that right? Yeah. So that's spiritually and doctrinally. Like, what are you doing right now? What are you doing in your life that is not in accord with the way that Christ would want you to live? Are you living up to the doctrines of the church? What are the small ways in which your life is not reflecting Christ? As you get deeper into that, you develop a lot more of an ability to act and react within the church. Historically, look at what the church has done. Look at the church throughout the ages and just really educate yourself on the nature of the church throughout time, and it'll give you a much better ability to have conversations, have dialogues with other Catholics, with people out in the world who don't understand this. It'll even help yourself to maybe come to understand what you're feeling in a better way. And socially as well. So a lot of us, again, we have our insular little groups of people we love and we're all comfortable with. Get out. Meet new people. At Mass, go find the people sitting alone. Create a culture of community within your parish. That's where it all starts. And that's what we suck at doing. So accept change. I think Chris put this one up there, but I do think it is a point worth mentioning. Parishes are going to be closing. There's going to be mergers. It's not realistic to assume that the way we've been doing things is the way they're going to be going forward. Be supporters of what needs to be done rather than trying to entrench yourself in what we've always done. Prepare to feel uncomfortable. We had some discussion around this at our table. This is just the beginning. things are going to get a lot more difficult for us as time goes on. And you know what? That's a good thing. We have had the longest period of, kind of integration with the culture and the culture being supportive of Christianity at any time in the church's history. That's not going to last. The very nature of the fact that we're standing with Christ necessitates that there is going to be trial. There's going to be tribulation, and the devil's going to do everything that he can to tear the church apart. And then parish life. This is my favorite part. So, as all of the people laughing can attest to, because they've heard it a million times, choose a parish and become a member. No more of this every Sunday I'm hopping around to a different place. Fine, do that, but pick a parish and get involved. Especially if everyone's going around asking, why aren't there more young adults? It's because we don't stay in one place long enough to form community. So pick a parish and get involved, even if you don't plan on staying there more than 2 years. Do what you can while you're there. Foster real community. That means investing some of your time. Some of your time. I'm not talking about all of it. I'm not talking about living at the rectory, but like once a week maybe twice a month. I don't care what it is, but invest some of your time. Choose a serious ministry and devote yourself to that, wherever you feel called. I don't care if it's doing really great things with the homeless, or it's Eucharistic ministering, or it's lecturing, or it's teaching our young kids catechesis. Go where you feel called and where you have an aptitude, and devote yourself to that ministry. Again, even if it's just for 2 years, you don't have to be playing the long game with everything you do. Just pick something and get invested in it. Identify improvements and become a change agent. The people running our parishes really aren't well adapted for a lot of things in the modern age. If you look at our websites, just don't for a lot of parishes. So if you have abilities, even social media, if you have abilities and things you're good at, help your parish, because they can't do it on their own. And then hold accountable and challenge your parish. So we're coming together tonight to discuss these things. It shouldn't stop here. When we leave, hold your priest accountable, hold your parish accountable. Do what you can to get involved, volunteer, and hold those around you accountable and invest. So definitely not an exhaustive list, but these are the things I wanted to harp on for tonight, so thank you for that.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize kind of the parish component. If you're involved in your parish, you see what's going on in your parish, and you can say what's happening. So I want to kind of go briefly, we're almost done, go over kind of what's next. So we're going to kind of be collecting what we talked about tonight, suggestions and recommendations people have. If you have additional thoughts, feel free to reach out. I think there's a form on the front page of the website, but then I'll also add something so you can have additional comments or feedback or things that you think should be different or adjusted. Really just looking for feedback. One thing that we will possibly do is draft a letter from the young adults, the Twin Cities, that people would be welcome to sign. And you can kind of subscribe on the website if you want updates on what's going on with that. And then also if you kind of signed in today with your email, you'll also get that information. If you didn't, you can also give me your email after this. One thing that I would be open to doing, and some of the others who kind of helped tonight, would be kind of taking this on the road, doing education in the parish. From what in my personal opinion, based on what I've heard from many priests, I think that this is a very poorly understood issue, and there are a lot of gut reactions, and there needs to be a lot more education. We're also open to other ideas. And then for more information, you can go on the website. Again, very open to feedback on that. And some of the resources on the website is like information from the John Jay study. It's really interesting. It's like a very, in my opinion, like a pretty well done study. I would highly recommend reading it in full. We've also put information on the Archdiocese, kind of like a timeline of what's going on, some of the big numbers. I've also kind of started adding links from homilies around the Twin Cities on these issues specifically, so you can know like, if your parish has like said something, and if your parish does have a homily or something online, send it to me and I'll add it to the list. Finally, just kind of like wrap things up. If anyone would like to go to the Bulldog for a beverage after this, I will probably go in a little bit, and you're all welcome to join. Thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, let me know any feedback. Actually, I asked Ben to close us in a prayer. Where's Ben? Can you do that?
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to come together. We unite as your people, as your church, O Lord God. We ask that in these times of trial, in this dark time for our church, that you continue to guide us and to lead us closer together as a people. Allow our differences and opinions to come together as one, to speak with one voice, and to support those around us that may be having a difficult time with the faith. Let us always point towards you in everything that we do. Continue to lead us towards you. Don't let us be bogged down by our fear and our inhibition, but Lord, allow us to chase after you. Let this be a launching point for us in our parishes. Let this be a launching point for us going forward, that our action does not stop here, but it continues to go out and go forth. That we all may become a people for you and continue to win people for your kingdom, O Lord God. Your church here on earth is hurting, but Lord, the church in heaven is strong. And we, your people here on earth, want to bring people towards that kingdom. Allow us to be the change in the church here on earth, and allow us to be your hands and feet here on earth as we continue forward in this dark time for our church. We ask for your guidance in everything that we do, and we turn to you in our time of need. We ask for the intercession of your Blessed Mother as we pray. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.